Good to see you this evening. We're thankful that we can be together and spend this time in the study of God's Word. As you could tell by the choice of the reading, we're staying in the book of John all day today. And tonight we're going to be looking at John chapter 9. We're going to be concerning ourselves with a very blessed blind man. Now, we don't normally think of someone who is blind as being blessed. And that's, of course, a great difficulty to face if we can't see. I know that all of you probably can have somebody in your family who's had difficulties with their sight. We've had that in my family, and I know it's in just about everybody's family, somebody having to face the difficulty of not being able to see. And remember in Ecclesiastes, at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, it speaks of the dimming of the windows of our eyes. And so we understand that's part of life. And this particular fella, as was read before us, he had been blind from birth. He never had seen. And that's, if you think about that, that also is a special challenge to think that you have no reference to think about. I've never seen anything. I don't know what anything looks like. He had to have thought about it, of course, but he never did see it. I had a little sister that was blind in that fashion, and I've mentioned to you about her before, but she was able to identify those of us who would come into her room without being able to see us, and she would make a different response depending upon who it was that had come into her room. So we know that there are people who are blind, and we know people who become blind. I think of one particular fella. I'm very much interested in what's called Americana or roots music, bluegrass type music, as a kind of a hobby to listen to that from time to time. And Doc Watson is one of those fellows that always amazed me. That of course he was blind early in life, but he got along so very well. This gentleman here lived at a time where there was not very much of an infrastructure to help people who had the kind of difficulties that he had. And it's an amazing thing to think about. Now, we know, because in our introduction to the studies in the book of John, we know that John includes these miraculous events as evidence that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is one of those particular situations. But what's so amazing about this is that the blind man himself gives evidence of tremendous intelligence and sagacity, really, in the way he responds to what was done for him and to the questioning that he had to put up with afterwards from the Pharisees and from the scribes. And just to kind of review, Jesus passes by. You heard the reading. Jesus passes by, and his disciples ask him the question, Rabbi, teacher, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents that caused him to be born blind? So what did they think? See, first thing we'll notice about him, that he was an object of misconception. People didn't understand why he was blind. In this time, it was not unusual for folks to think that if a person is blind, it was because of sinfulness in either his life or the life of his parents. And of course, you and I understand from our study of the New Testament, because they didn't have the whole New Testament, did they? They didn't have anything of the New Testament at this point in time when this was being written. But we understand that there's the consequence of physical consequence of blindness has nothing to do with sinfulness. Now, it could if you behaved in such a fashion that you brought about upon yourself a physical condition through an accident or foolishness or the use of too much alcohol or any alcohol or drugs or anything like that. You could bring the condition upon yourself, but it's not a quid pro quo. In other words, this man is not blind because he sinned. And so Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But there was a special purpose associated with this particular man's blindness. And that special purpose was so that the power of God could be shown in him. The text, Jesus says, but that the works of God, or the power of God, should be revealed in him. Then Jesus says, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, I read verse 5 again for you in order for us to see the connection. He said, I am the light of the world. And the connection there is with this man who is blind. And of course, I don't know how much he could discern light from darkness, if he could discern any at all. We're not told that. Well, we understand there's a strong connection between being able to discern light and being able to see. But Jesus is the light of the world, not only in terms of being able to grant this man the ability to see, but he is the light of the world in a spiritual sense. And remember, as we mentioned this morning, this is one of those important things about the book of John that we need to remember. That John is telling us throughout this whole book that there is one of the most important distinctions in our lives is to understand the difference between our physical existence and the importance of those things and our spiritual reality. You know, life is fun, I think. I mean, I enjoy every day. There's something about every day that I enjoy. Ginger and I are always laughing. Her mama said, y'all laugh too much. I told her that she laughed. No, she didn't really mean that, but she was remarking on how much we laughed. We enjoy life, right? And Mark is always getting after me about, you can come to this because we're having food. Well, see, he gave me a Snickers. Wasn't that sweet? If I opened that and ate it now, it would bother you children, wouldn't it? How can the preacher have a Snicker and we can't have a Snicker? Well, I'll have that Snicker before I go to bed tonight, I'll assure you. Now, I love stuff like that, don't you? But that can't be the be-all of life. We have to understand that there's more to it than that. And that's what the book of John helps us to understand. It's just like when Nicodemus said, you know, a man can't enter in again to his mother's womb and be born. Jesus says, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your spiritual rebirth. So he said those things, he spat on the ground, he made his clay and told him to go wash that off of your face. And then what happens? Well, verse 8 says, therefore the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? This was at a time when people, and we're getting, in some places, even in Athens where I live, we're getting people who sit in certain places and beg, essentially. You know, but that's the way it was. That was more common back in that time. That was a normal situation. So everybody knew that this man had been blind. So it was a clear-cut example of a miraculous activity. There was no doubt about it. Verses 6 through 12, there was no doubt about it. Now, he didn't understand. The blind man himself at first did not understand what was going on. But people around him said, isn't this the fellow that was blind? And the other said, this is he. And somebody said, no, he's like him. But then he said, no, I'm the one. So he would know he'd been blind. There was no doubt in his mind, I've been blind all my life. Therefore they said to him, well, how were your eyes open? And he said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I did it, he said, and I received sight. And they said, well, where is he? He said, I don't know. I just don't know. Now, I'm trying to emphasize those features of this particular account to indicate what a remarkable thing the book of John is. That it is telling us these events, these remarkable, these 7 miracles, and these other things that he talks about in this gospel. He's telling us this in such a matter-of-fact fashion. A remarkable thing to think about. Well, he said, I don't know who did this. Now, we know, because we've been reading up through to this point, that the Pharisees, if I asked the young people that were gathered down here when Bryce was going through the things with them, were the Pharisees on Jesus' side or were they against Jesus? What would you say? The Pharisees were against him, weren't they? Well, when this happened, they wanted to know, where'd you get your sight? The reason they wanted to know is they didn't want any competition. But everybody knew that a man who'd been blind since birth had received his sight. So they brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. And it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. The Pharisees also asked him again how he'd received his sight. And he said, to put the clay on my eyes, I washed and I saw. Therefore, some, if you look at verse 16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Well, that was not true, was it? What happened if your ox was in the ditch? You got him out. So an ox in the ditch, it's okay to get the ox out of the ditch. Go back and read Leviticus. So it's certainly all right if you can do that, if you're able to allow a man that has never seen in his life to be able to see, you're certainly able to do that. Well, that also indicates that the one who was directing this blind man to do what he did to be able to see had to be special, had to be very, very special. And we know Jesus was special because we know the whole story. They said this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, whoa, whoa, whoa. How can a man who is a sinner do such things? And there was a division among them. There were people who could understand, well, listen, if we've got somebody walking around town here that can help this man see, and we all know he's never seen, this has got to be a very special, very unusual individual. And so they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him? Because he opened your eyes. And so this fella showed that he was an individual of remarkable intelligence. He had a good mind, and he had plenty of moral courage. That's why I love this fella, this blind man. He's famous for these characteristics. And so when they asked him, well, what do you think he is? He said, he's a prophet. And the blind man didn't know, he didn't have to know much, did he? He might not have ever been to Gamaliel or any of the other great rabbis of the time. But he knew one thing, that if I didn't see before that fella spat on the ground and mixed that clay up and put it in my eyes, and then when I washed it off I could see. Some people say, well, that man must have had some cataracts, and what Jesus did was just wash the cataracts away. No. You think that's the first time the fellow had ever washed his face? No, he had mom and a daddy. He washed his face. If he had something that could be wiped away with mere cleansing, he would have done that before. You know he would have. Now, but he's smart enough to know that what happened was reminded him of things that happened in the Old Testament that were done by prophets like Elijah, Elisha, and these other fellows. So it didn't take very much for him to understand. See, he knew enough about the Bible to know that anybody who can do this must be a prophet. That's a testimony of the prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called his parents of the one who received his sight. So they didn't believe that he'd been blind. So they talked to his mom and daddy. Now they asked him, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see now?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and we know that he is born blind." Now, you know, if your mom and daddy would know if you were their child, and furthermore, they'd know if you were blind, just like that little sister of mine. We all knew she was blind. She was born that way, and it was not even a matter of question or doubt. But by what means, verse 21, he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he'll speak for himself. And not only was the fellow that was born blind an intelligent fellow with good moral courage, his parents, even though they had some fear in their lives because of who was allowing them to suffer this inquisition, even though they were concerned about that, still they knew enough to say, "Go ask him. He knows what he's talking about." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, they'd put out of the synagogue. So they had agreed to do that. Now, when it says the Jews, when the Bible, particularly in the book of John, refers to this group of the Pharisees that is acting in this fashion, they expect the reader, in terms of those of us who are reading, or the ones that heard this material read, to understand something that in the first century there were Jews who were opposed to the idea of somebody like Jesus being the Messiah, and there are other Jews who were accepting of that idea. There was a remnant. There was a righteous remnant. Micah talks about it. The Old Testament talks about the righteous remnant. There's a group of individuals who knew enough about the Old Testament to understand that somebody like Jesus was indeed going to be the Messiah. In other words, Jesus fit all the qualifications there in the Old Testament to concern someone to be the Messiah. And evidently, even though he's not famous to us in terms of a name, this blind man was part of that remnant. What did it take to be part of the remnant? It took understanding that if somebody shows up and can do supernatural activities, that person is qualified to be the Messiah. That's what this man knew. He understood it. And so his parents, who naturally a little bit concerned because this Jewish establishment, particularly that group of those Pharisees that were looking out for themselves and themselves alone, they had a lot of power in that town. They could cause trouble for you. And so they said, "You ask him." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, and they knew they had already made up their minds that Jesus could not be the Christ. That is, this particular group of the non-remnant Jews. He is of age, ask him. So again they called the man who was blind, and they said to him, "Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner." Now I find this to be so fascinating, and what a wonderful thing it is that it's recorded through the Holy Spirit in God's book for us. I love the interact. Here we've got this so-called educated bunch of folks. Have you ever noticed that there are people who have the reputation of education that don't have any education? Have you ever noticed that there are a lot of people who've got all the boxes checked? You boys that have to hire folks, you ladies that have to fire folks, you know what it means to have the boxes checked. But you interview them, and what do you find out? Dumb as stumps, you see. So there were people like that in the ancient world also. And so, give God the glory. We know this man's a sinner. Here's a blind fella. I tell you, he hadn't been to school, but he'd been listening to something. He'd been listening to God's words, what he'd been listening to. And he says, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. Well, he's telling the truth. He doesn't know that anything about Jesus yet. He comes to know it, but he doesn't know it yet. He says, one thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see. And you know, I make a lot about it. I do believe it's important for us to understand the spiritual elements of our lives that we don't fully understand. However, in the fact that I observe some humility a lot of humility with regard to what God's will is. I do know that God expects us to use our minds. And this is what happens here. This is what's happening here. He said, you talk about him all you want to talk about him. You talk about Jesus what you want to say about him. But I'll tell you one thing. Before he did what he did, I couldn't see anything. And now I can see. Now that's amazing. And I love the way he stuck by his guns with regard to that. They said to him again, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, well, I told you already. And I like his gumption. Don't you like his gumption? I told you already. It's like, here are these smart fellas. They can't understand, I guess he would be speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, probably Aramaic, or Greek. He probably couldn't be speaking Greek in this particular point in time. Anyway, he says, I told you already. You did not listen. Do you want to hear it again? And then he twists them a little bit. You know, sometimes you can do that in a conversation to help somebody understand. He said, do you want to become his disciple? Well, he knew they didn't, but he wanted to get their attention. They reviled him and said, you are his disciple, we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we did not know where he is from. Verse 30. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing. This is a marvelous, in the New King James, amazing thing. This is a wonderful thing. Isn't this the wildest thing you have ever seen, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes? Now the blind man, this blessed blind man, is going back to a pragmatic point, an absolutely essential understanding. I did not see a thing before this man did what he did, and I see now. That's the one fact we have. So it's marvelous that here he is, he's able to do this, and you don't know where he's from. Well, these fellows are supposed to know their Old Testament. What was a key characteristic of an Old Testament prophet? What could Elijah do? He had a barbecue contest, didn't he? Mount Carmel. Miracles. The key characteristic of an Old Testament prophet is the ability to do that which is miraculous. And then verse 31. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Now, John chapter 9, verse 31 was written at the time when everybody was under what? In terms of law. Either the law of Moses or some form of the patriarchal dispensation, but here in Jerusalem we're talking about the law of Moses primarily, or somebody who would be associated therewith, perhaps not altogether. But the fact is that everybody in the whole world at that time that was interested in Jehovah God, the God of the Old Testament at that time, knew this fact, that God does not hear a sinner's prayer. Now, this bothers people today because they think about somebody who's not a Christian and therefore an unforgiven sinner praying. Now, hearing a prayer, there's two ways to hear something. God's aware of everybody's word that they ever say or think. If you've thought it, God knows it. You believe that? If you've thought it, God knows. So God hears your prayer, even if you're praying without any business praying. If you've never even thought of liking God and you prayed, He still knows you did it. But to hear a prayer in the sense that this man refers to this idea and concept is to hear it with an ear toward answering that prayer. And God doesn't do that for sinners. As far as I know, God may catalog, He may have cataloged all my prayers before I became a Christian, and he would know them. I believe that. And folks, you kids understand something. God's knowledge of you and this world is infinite. There's nothing about us and this world that he doesn't know. If a squirrel ran across the power line, he knows it. So how could he do that? It's because his mind is different from ours. His mind is infinite. And so I just love what this man says. He says, now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Now that would be true under the law of Moses, wouldn't it? Certainly would. Now we want to enter into a relationship with Jesus Christ under the new covenant. That's a different situation a little bit, but the process here is one with which we are familiar. And then he says, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who'd been born blind. You think about that. It's still true, isn't it? Somebody's been born blind. If the doctors cannot figure out the physical malady that caused that blindness, it can't be corrected. I mentioned Doc Watson. What happened when Doc Watson was a little baby? They gave him some drops in his eyes that were the wrong dose or the wrong formula, and it caused him to be blind. You can't reverse that. My little sister had brain damage that technology didn't exist and doesn't exist to reverse it after that happened. So what the blind man said right here, the blind man that could now see, what he said is still true. You can't reverse that unless, of course, you are a prophet of God. In particular, in this situation, Jesus. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who had been born blind. If this man, blind man said, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Well, that is irrefutable. The statement is unanswerable. Here is this fellow who's been sitting around blind all these years. He said something you can't answer. If he wasn't from God, I wouldn't be able to see. So what do? Well, they said, you're completely born in sins, and you're teaching us, and they cast him out. Well, what happens when you can't answer a reasonable argument or a rational question? You know what the Pharisees said in essence? They just accused him of being ignorant and threw him out of the club. Threw him out of, just, you're out of the temple. You're out of the synagogue. You're out of this, that, and that. Well, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? He answered, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? See, he still wants to know. Man's remarkably intelligent. Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking to you. And so he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Well, what else could he say? This is the man that couldn't see before Jesus did what he did, and now he sees. Naturally he believes. It has to be him. Now, if he could, we weren't there. And somebody says, how do you know that's right? Well, I know it's right because the Bible's inspired of God. And there's too much in this world that's evidence of the existence of God and the power of God, and this makes sense. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those that see may be made blind. Who was he talking about? Well, he's talking about the Pharisees. And the Pharisees heard that he was talking about that. And he said, are we blind also? He said, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say we see, therefore your sin remains. See, that's another great principle in the book of John. It's one thing to realize that you don't know something, or you don't see, or you don't understand. It's one thing to know that about yourself. I don't have full understanding of everything in this book. I know that about myself. You know that about yourself. That's honesty. That's honesty. But to say, I know it, and therefore I can make myself a judge of you because I know it, when I know that I don't know it all, that's dangerous. It's dangerous. You know, kind of judgment we can exercise. Oh, yeah, we can exercise judgment if we have book, chapter, and verse. That's where our judgment comes from. Now, look, isn't that a wonderful thing to think about? Think about that tonight as you pillow your head. About here was this poor, blind man, blind from birth, and yet he was a source of great wisdom, wisdom greater than that of this educated bunch of Pharisees. And he stands as a great testimony that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If tonight you find yourself in need of God's grace and mercy, you can come in faith, turn away from your sin, confess Jesus is the Christ, be baptized into Christ to be raised to walk in newness of life. That plan of salvation is easy to understand. All we have to do is do it. If you need to come back to the Lord, if you need the prayers of these saints, would you come as together we stand and sing?